Caroline had always prided herself on being a loving wife. She and her husband, Mark, had built a life together over 10 years of marriage, filled with shared dreams and quiet evenings. But somewhere along the way, routine had dulled the spark they once had. She never thought she'd stray, until he entered their lives. David, Mark's boss, was everything Mark no longer seemed to be. He was confident, charismatic, and attentive in a way that made Caroline feel seen. At first, it was just friendly banter when they crossed paths at company events. David had a way of asking about her life, her passions, her thoughts. Questions Mark rarely asked anymore. It started innocently enough. A lingering glance, a touch on her hand that lingered a moment too long. Caroline told herself it meant nothing. But then came the text messages, witty, flattering, and increasingly suggestive. One evening, Mark brought David home for dinner. Caroline had insisted on hosting. She wanted to prove to herself that her feelings were just a harmless crush. But the air between her and David crackled with tension. When Mark left the room to take a phone call, David's hand brushed hers again. She froze but didn't pull away. That night was a turning point. Weeks later, with Mark working late on a big project, Caroline found herself at David's downtown apartment. The pull was irresistible, like a current dragging her out to sea. She knew it was wrong. Every kiss, every touch carried the weight of guilt, but she couldn't stop herself. The affair lasted months. Every time she looked at Mark, guilt gnawed at her insides. Yet David's attention made her feel alive in ways she hadn't in years. She tried to justify it, blaming the monotony of her marriage, the emotional distance that had grown between her and Mark. But secrets have a way of surfacing. One evening, Mark came home unexpectedly early. Caroline had left her phone on the kitchen counter, and a message from David flashed across the screen. Asterisk, last night was unforgettable. I can't wait to see you again. Asterisk, Mark's face paled as he read the words. When Caroline walked in, the look in his eyes told her everything. The confrontation was explosive, filled with anger, pain, and questions she couldn't answer. She begged for forgiveness, but the damage was done. Mark didn't yell or throw accusations. Instead, he packed a bag and left. For the first time in years, Caroline was alone. The weight of her choices bore down on her, suffocating and inescapable. David called later that night, but she ignored it. She knew now that what she thought was passion had only been a fleeting escape. It wasn't love, just a cruel illusion that had cost her everything. Caroline sat alone in the dimly lit living room, the quietness of the house amplifying the chaos in her mind. She tried calling Mark, but each call went to voicemail. She left messages, her voice cracking with desperation, but no response came. Her guilt consumed her. She had betrayed the man who had stood by her for a decade, who had trusted her without question. The affair, which once felt exhilarating, now felt hollow. David's calls became incessant, but Caroline couldn't bring herself to answer. She had wrecked her life, and she couldn't bear to face the man who had played a part in it. The next morning, Caroline drove to Mark's office, hoping to speak with him. She waited outside the building, her heart pounding every time someone exited the doors. Hours passed, but Mark never appeared. She later learned he had called in sick. Feeling defeated, she returned home. David's car was parked outside, and he was waiting on her porch. He rose as she approached, his confident demeanor replaced with concern. "You haven't been answering my calls," he said. Caroline avoided his gaze. "David, this was a mistake." He frowned, his charm faltering. "A mistake? Caroline, She interrupted him, her voice sharp. "This isn't love. It was never love. I've destroyed my marriage, my life, for something that was nothing more than an escape." David's expression hardened. "You didn't seem to think it was nothing at the time." "Maybe I didn't," she admitted, "but I see it clearly now. I need to fix things with Mark, if that's even possible. I can't do this anymore." David's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He stepped back, gave her one last look, and left without another word. The silence of his departure felt deafening, but Caroline didn't have time to dwell. She had to find Mark. She drove to their favorite park, a place they used to visit when things were simpler. It was a long shot, but her instincts proved right. Mark was sitting on a bench near the lake, staring out at the water. His shoulders were slumped, his face drawn. Caroline approached cautiously, her throat tight with emotion. "Mark," she said softly. He turned to look at her, his eyes red but void of anger. "What do you want, Caroline?" "I want to apologize," she said, her voice trembling. "I was selfish, and I betrayed you in the worst way possible. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to tell you how sorry I am." Mark looked at her for a long moment before shaking his head. "Do you even know why you did it?" She hesitated, then nodded. "I was lonely. I felt unseen. But that doesn't excuse what I did. It doesn't justify the hurt I caused you." He let out a bitter laugh. "You should have told me, Caroline. We could have worked on it. But now, I don't know if we can." Tears streamed down her face. "I'll do whatever it takes, Mark. Therapy, counseling, time, anything. I don't want to lose you." Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I need time to think. Right now, I can't even look at you without seeing him." Caroline nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here waiting. If you decide we're worth trying again." Mark didn't respond. Turning back to the lake, Caroline walked away, leaving him with his thoughts. That night, the house felt emptier than ever. But for the first time, Caroline resolved to face her mistakes head-on. She didn't know if she could ever fix what she had broken, but she owed it to Mark and herself to try. Weeks passed, and the silence between Caroline and Mark remained unbroken. He had moved into a hotel for the time being, only returning to the house briefly to pick up clothes or documents. Each time he came, their exchanges were polite but strained. Caroline wanted to reach out, to say something that would make it all better, but she knew she had to give him the space he needed. She started therapy on her own. At first, it was overwhelming to confront the depths of her guilt and the reasons behind her choices. Her therapist, a kind but firm woman named Dr. Benson, helped her unpack the loneliness she had been bearing for years. Caroline realized that her dissatisfaction in the marriage wasn't entirely Mark's fault. She had stopped communicating her needs long before the affair began. One evening, Mark called. It was the first time in weeks that he reached out, and Caroline's heart raced as she answered. "Hi," he said, his voice hesitant. "Hi," she replied softly. "I've been thinking," he began, "about us, about everything. I still don't know if I can forgive you, but I think I'm willing to try." Tears welled in Caroline's eyes. "Mark, I'll do whatever it takes. I've started therapy, and I'm learning how much I failed to communicate with you before all of this. I want to fix that. I want to fix us. I'm not promising anything," he said, "but maybe we can start with counseling together. If we're going to rebuild, we have to start somewhere." "Of course," she said quickly. "Anything you need. I just want a chance to make this right." Their first session together was awkward and tense. Mark was guarded, and Caroline struggled to find the right words to express her remorse without sounding defensive. But as the weeks went on, they began to open up to each other in ways they hadn't in years. Mark admitted that he, too, had neglected their relationship. His long hours at work and his assumption that everything was fine had left Caroline feeling invisible. "I didn't see how unhappy you were," he confessed during one session. "I thought we were okay because you never said otherwise." Caroline nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I should have told you. I was afraid of hurting you, and instead, I did something that hurt you even more." Their progress was slow, but it was progress. They began spending time together again, sharing meals, and even laughing at old memories. The distance between them gradually began to shrink. One night, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Mark turned to her and said, "I'm still angry, Caroline. I probably will be for a long time. But I can see you're trying, and I want to keep trying too. Caroline reached for his hand, her heart swelling with hope. I'll keep trying every day, Mark. I promise. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, they both felt that their marriage might have a chance. It wouldn't be easy, and it would never be the same as it was before. But maybe, just maybe, it could be something new, something stronger. Months turned into a year, and though the wounds between Caroline and Mark hadn't fully healed, they had begun to scab over. Their lives were no longer a storm of arguments and silences. Instead, they had settled into a tentative rhythm of rebuilding trust and rediscovering each other. Counseling had opened doors that both had kept locked for years. Caroline learned to speak openly about her feelings, no longer bottling up her frustrations. Mark, in turn, made a conscious effort to be present, to listen, and to prioritize their relationship over work. They both agreed that their marriage had been a two-person failure, even if Caroline's affair was the sharpest betrayal. One Friday evening, Mark came home with a bouquet of lilies, Caroline's favorite. He handed them to her without saying a word, but the softness in his expression spoke volumes. "What's the occasion?" she asked, surprised. "No occasion," he said, shrugging. "I just wanted to remind you that I see you." Caroline felt her throat tighten as she placed the flowers in a vase. It was a small gesture, but it carried immense weight. Later that night, as they sat on the couch together, Caroline took Mark's hand. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said softly, "but I want you to know how much I appreciate your willingness to try." Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of lingering hurt and cautious hope. "Forgiveness isn't a moment, Caroline. It's a process, and I'm not fully there yet, but I've seen how hard you've worked to change. That means something." Their intimacy returned slowly. At first, it was small things, a lingering touch, a shared smile, a conversation that felt unguarded. Over time, they found themselves rediscovering the passion that had been buried beneath years of neglect. One evening, as they lay in bed together, Mark spoke quietly. "Do you ever think about him? About David?" The question startled Caroline, but she didn't shy away from it. "No," she said firmly. "He was a symptom of a problem I didn't know how to address. But he was never what I wanted. What I want, what I've always wanted, is you." Mark nodded, his jaw tightening. "I believe you," he said after a long pause. "But sometimes the thought of it still creeps in." Caroline squeezed his hand. "I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that you're the only one who matters." In time, the memories of the affair became less like open wounds and more like faded scars. They didn't forget what had happened. Neither of them ever would. But they learned to live with it, using the experience as a reminder of how fragile love could be if left untended. Years later, as they celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary, surrounded by friends and family, Mark raised a glass for a toast. "To resilience," he said, looking directly at Caroline. "To fighting for what matters. And to building something stronger out of the broken pieces." Caroline smiled through her tears, knowing they had done just that. Their love was no longer perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs.